My first question, who was Blumentritt?
Blumentritt is an Austrian, German, Bohemian, or you can call it Czech, or it's a contested nationality. Okay, so but he is German. He's Bohemian, definitely, and he was a high school teacher. He was given rank of a professor by the town council of Light Marriage, and although he did not have a PhD, so he was not a doctor, but he was given the rank. So he studied in Charles University, in I think that will be in Prague. He finished, I think, geography and history. I'm not very sure now, but history and geography. As a boy, he was interested with Spanish culture, with the Spanish colonies, and he taught himself languages. So he can speak, he can read Spanish even as a boy. His interest with Spain led him to his more focused interest on the Philippines. So he was an expert on Philippine studies even before Rizal started to specialize in Philippine studies. So his home was practically a museum of Philippine artifacts, a library of Philippine materials. So Rizal learned about Blumentritt first, and Jose Rizal, our national hero, wrote him a letter, introduced himself to Blumentritt, and it was the beginning of a lifelong friendship until Jose Rizal died. Blumentritt treasured the friendship even after Jose Rizal died.
My second question is with respect to your very interesting book that I have read. There you say that he had a hermeneutic approach in his work. And this is also very interesting for modern Philippine studies. Philippine studies. Could you explain this?
Philippine studies is a field that we're pursuing in the Philippines, and we're not really very clear about how to do this. What are the intentions? What are the motives behind this? Or why are we doing this? One of my major findings in this book is that the hermeneutic approach of Blumentritt is that he drowned himself, he immersed himself in materials about Philippines. That he can know which of these materials are reliable and which of these materials are not reliable, simply because he was so immersed on this knowledge about Philippine culture and Philippine history. Okay, Blumentritt was never able to visit Philippines, yet his knowledge about the Philippines was immense. What was very remarkable, he was able to draw a map, an ethno-linguistic map of the Philippines that is fairly accurate. So the map is a very accurate during his days. Of course, today we have to update that map, but it was a very useful map during his time. And I even decided to put that map as the cover of my book. So that's how sharp his knowledge was about the Philippines. And he was doing Philippine studies in order to give a better life, a better future for the Filipinos. So he's committed for the welfare, for the interests of the Filipinos. So I think our contemporary scholars of Philippine studies, our contemporary practitioners of Philippine studies should learn from Blumentritt that Philippine studies is not a neutral subject matter. It's not a neutral discourse, but it is a discourse that is supposed to give the Filipinos a more humane, a more egalitarian society, a better Philippines, so to say.
Could you just talk a bit about Rizal, especially when I show this piece not here?
Yes.
People outside the Philippines are not so familiar with Rizal. So maybe could you also give a short introduction to Rizal?
So Rizal is an intellectual. So he was a medical student here, and at that time, I'm not really very sure now, but I think at that time you cannot finish a full medical degree here. So you have to go out. You have to go out from the country in order to finish your medical degree. So he went to Spain, and he was surprised because the Spaniards meticulously controlled knowledge in the Philippines. So the books, even the language was controlled. So there was a royal decree from Spain that all colonies of Spain should learn how to speak Spanish, how to read Spanish. But in the Philippines, that was never done. So only very select, privileged Filipinos were able to master, were able to read the language. So when Rizal went to Spain, so he was involved in this propaganda movement, trying to argue that Philippines should be made into a legitimate province of Spain. So with all the privileges of the Spanish states or the Spanish provinces. So that's what their advocacy was all about. And they had this newspaper that comes out every 2 weeks, La Solidaridad, and he was part of that. Blumentritt was part of that. And Rizal was actually looking for sympathizers from Europe. Okay, so here in the Philippines, the Spaniards were the oppressors. But when they went to Spain, they saw that there were a number of Spaniards, there was a number of Spanish citizens who were actually sympathetic to the cause of the Filipinos. Rizal saw these people as their allies. Okay, so there are some sort of people who will legitimize their discourse, their propaganda, the propaganda movement that they're doing. And Blumentritt is one of them. So Rizal was so happy that there is this European who knows so much about the Philippines. Although Blumentritt at that time was pro-Spanish. So his nickname in Bohemia at that time was the Spaniard. He was the Spaniard. He loved Spain so much. He is a supporter of Spain. But gradually, when Rizal talked to Blumentritt and showed him the more realistic conditions in the Philippines, then he was able to sway Blumentritt. From being a supporter of Spain, he became a critic of Spain. Until finally, he even advocated for the Filipinos, support the Filipinos' revolution against Spain. So Rizal is considered our national hero. Many Filipinos during the revolution considered him a great hero. Okay, so his novels, the two novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, they're considered classics in the Philippines. Okay, so the two greatest Filipino novels are still these two novels written by Jose Rizal. So it's about, these two novels are talking about how the Filipinos are oppressed by the friars, are oppressed by the colonial government, and they opened the eyes of the Filipinos and they saw that they were oppressed. At that time, maybe it was so vague because very few Filipinos were educated, and the novels of Rizal helped these Filipinos realize that indeed they were oppressed and they should do something about this oppression.
I am very fascinated because the more I learn about Jose Rizal, I realized that he was really an intellectual and he was also questioning himself.
Yes.
So he was really searching for truth, and
yes.
It's for me interesting that such a person becomes a national hero, because if we think about revolutionaries, they are often also intellectuals, but they are not questioning themselves so much, and they have a more pragmatic approach. In order to have a revolution, but he even opposed for a long time the revolution. Because he thought that the Filipinos are not ready yet.
Yes.
Could you talk a bit more about this?
There was a time when Rizal was actually saying, I'm already convinced that I'm for revolution. And then Blumentritt was the one telling him, no. In order for you to have a revolution, you must have this, you must have this, you must have this. You don't have these things yet. Don't go for the revolution. So it was Blumentritt who was restraining him. And then finally, Rizal was killed. And it was the time when Blumentritt would say, you go for the revolution. It's hopeless. There's nothing anymore you can hope for if you just bank all your aspirations on Spain. Spain will never give you these things, and you better have this revolution.
And how many languages did Rizal know?
I am not really very sure about the actual number, but he knew a lot of languages. So I'm sure he can speak German. He corresponded with Blumentritt in German. He can speak English, Spanish of course, and Filipino of course, and more than 10 languages. So he was really, and he actually invested time and money learning some of these languages. So for instance, when he was in Germany, he paid some tutor to teach him. When he was, I think, in France, he was really eager to learn these languages. So Blumentritt studied on his own. Rizal is willing to pay a tutor in order for him to learn the language in a very maybe faster, in a more efficient way.
What I read in the correspondence was that Rizal had a problem to write in Tagalog his novels.
Yes.
Although it was also his language.
It was his language.
But he was used to Spanish.
To Spanish, yes. So it's a problem. It's a common problem among many Filipinos today. Even those who are Tagalog speakers, they cannot write. They cannot write in Tagalog because they were trained to speak English, to read in English. Now, I think it's similar. It's a similar situation. During the time of Rizal, he was trained practically. He was immersed in Spanish literature, and maybe the way he thinks is already Spanish. And he decided he was planning to write a third novel in Filipino, but he could not do it. Some of our writers, Andres Bonifacio, for instance, who wrote in a very dramatic, in a very literary way in Filipino. But the problem is, if you write in Filipino at the time, or Tagalog, you will only be able to communicate to a very small section of the country, because the other countries are not able to understand Filipino. So they speak Cebuano, they speak Ilocano, and so on. So only those who studied here in Manila can manage to read in Filipino. So writing in Spanish might have been a better choice because he can communicate to the other ilustrados, or to the other privileged Filipinos who are from the other ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines.
That's also what Blumentritt wrote to Rizal, that they should use Spanish as a language.
Yes.
To communicate between the different groups.
Yes.
Lacalle was a Spanish military doctor of long resistance in the Philippines, and he was the author of several articles to which Blumentritt replied. Blumentritt wrote to Rizal, "I'm glad that my articles are liked by your compatriots. Lacalle is furious at my reply, but I cannot do anything else. We say in German, the truth should be honored." So for me this is an interesting quote because it says a lot about Blumentritt's attitude. Blumentritt's continuous transition from being a European intellectual with colonial prejudices to a fighter, finally, against racism and Eurocentristic ignorance is mainly based on his search for truth. Despite that, Blumentritt never really broke with his conservative principles, his religion, and never changed his path as a bohemian scientist.
Yeah, so I think it was really Rizal who caused the transition by giving Blumentritt a feel of what it was to be a Filipino on the ground here. So maybe at the time what he was reading were filtered, censored materials written by Spaniards. So gradually, when Blumentritt accumulated all this knowledge about the Philippines, he can already tell which of the Spanish materials are reliable, which of the Spanish materials are not reliable. So for instance, he will use same Spanish materials in talking about why is it that Spaniards would usually say that Filipinos are lazy, Filipinos are ignorant. And if you're going to take a look at the other ethnographic notes of the Spaniards, they will extol how industrious these Filipinos are. So he can feel his way through this maze of text and say, I think these materials are not reliable. These materials are more accurate about the Philippines. Of course, the Filipinos are feeding him with text, and they will mail materials, even newspaper articles about the Philippines. And one thing that Blumentritt enjoyed also is responding to anti-Filipino articles published in newspapers. So he will read these anti-Filipino articles. I think that's one of the articles that you are mentioning, and he's going to answer. He's going to answer point by point this criticisms against the Filipino, and he's defending, in fact, or in practice, he's defending the Filipino against this anti-Filipino bashings of this very close-minded Spanish writers. There are many of them. That he's attacking.
In your book, you said that there are lessons that modern scholars can learn from Blumentritt. How to do it and how not to do it. Also, your critical approach.
I think one of the most important lessons is you should not be ashamed about being political with Philippine studies. So Philippine studies is not a neutral discourse. So if you let foreigners do Philippine studies for you, then Philippines might be in a disadvantage. So scholars must push for the interest of the Filipinos, using Philippine studies as a way of improving the Philippine conditions. So I think that's one of the most important things. And Blumentritt also, I think one of the lessons also is to use as many languages as useful, as they are useful to you. Okay, so Blumentritt can shift from English to Spanish to German in his writing. So if he's writing for this very specialized German scientist, then he's going to write in German and publish it in journals. And if he's going to write in very propagandist discourses, then he's going to write in Spanish and publish it in La Solidaridad. So he can shift from a very scholarly academic article into a very journalistic, propagandistic form. So you have to use so many forms. And the other thing is, we have a tendency to isolate the Philippines from Southeast Asia. So it's because when the Spanish came, Philippines, they only own the Philippines, not the other parts of Southeast Asia. They control the Philippines. So when they talk about the Philippines, they tend to isolate the Philippines from Southeast Asia. The Americans also did the same thing. So when they talk about the Philippines, it is as if the Philippines is not part of Asia or Southeast Asia. Blumentritt would scan the region, and he would contextualize Philippines as part of Southeast Asia. So for instance, today many Filipinos, if they go to these Malay-speaking neighbors, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and even some parts of Thailand, they will be surprised by Singapore. They will be surprised by the familiarity with language. So many words that are common to our culture. And why is it that we're like this? So it's because we're part of Southeast Asia. We're part of one people. The culture is so similar.
Could you explain a little bit more the post-Rizal period of Blumentritt?
Okay, so that was the time when Rizal was already executed, and Blumentritt is now supporting the revolution. He was now supporting the revolution against Spain. So there's no hope anymore. You should support. But the revolution was already there, was already happening. Okay, so when he said we should be for this revolution. But when the Americans came, he changed his view again. So he said, no, don't support the Americans. You better support the Spaniards, because if Americans will win this war and they will control the Philippines, there is no way for you to regain independence anymore, because the Americans are more powerful, definitely more powerful. They will control you definitely, and you will not be able to free yourselves from these very powerful Americans. Whereas if the Spaniards will win the war, then they will control the Philippines, and they're already very weak. So maybe in a matter of time, you will gain you will regain your independence.
But you also criticized him because for the revolutionaries it was important for their self-conscious also to say, okay, we are fighting against the Spaniards,
Okay.
so we have to continue to do it, and we cannot just change sides.
Yes, yes,
strategically,
yes, yes.
as Blumentritt.
Yes, yes, yes. He was doing it in a very rational, in a more detached way. So he was saying the more strategic option is to support Spain, but the momentum is really against Spain. So many people thought that the Americans were allies, but he already noticed no, they're going to double cross. They're going to double deal with you Filipinos. He noticed that already. For 300 years, almost 300 years, then there was this movement against Spain. So it was very easy to overthrow Spain because there were very few Spaniards in the Philippines. The forces here were actually Filipinos. The Spaniards were actually dependent on Filipino soldiers. But of course, they have their own ways of maintaining loyalty to Spain. Then the Spanish-American War happened. So because of that war, America is now able to come to the Philippines and declare it's part of the war. It's part of the war. So we're going to fight the Spaniards who are here in the Philippines. So while the Katipunan was already gaining success, well, of course we already declared our republic, then the Americans came. And then the Treaty of Paris, okay, so the discussions in Paris were done without Filipino representatives. So America, Spain, they never recognized the Philippine Republic. And then the American government paid the Spanish government $20 million, I think. And so Philippines is now under given to America. Even those territories that were not controlled by Spain. So that's the problem that we have now. Mindanao. A huge part of Mindanao was not conquered by Spain. And yet when Spain said, we're going to sell the Philippines, the Mindanao is sold together with the rest of the country to the Americans. So that's one of the problems that we have in Mindanao, because they were not really integrated during the Filipino times, in Spanish times. Yeah, so until now we're still dominated. We feel we're still dominated by America. Even our language, so we have difficulties. Okay, if you take a look around, okay, so many Filipinos cannot think in Filipino, cannot think in our own language. So we're struggling thinking using the American language. And we have difficulties because that's not our mother tongue. So many Filipinos could not think in Filipino and they could not think straight in English. That's why this is how we look like in the Philippines.